Thank you for joining me as I continue my examination of the book Cold Case Christianity by J. Warner Wallace, examining it, analyzing it, responding to it from my atheist perspective. In this video, I'm going to cover chapters 5 and 6 of the book. So let's get started with a look at chapter 5, principle number 5, hang on every word. Now, as you know, if you've been watching the series up to this point, Wallace likes to begin each chapter with a little anecdote from his days as a detective. And the opening anecdote in this chapter is Wallace recalling the cold case investigation of a woman's murder from 1981, where he and his fellow detectives were at a loss where to even begin. They had no suspects at all. They didn't even know who to start talking to or who to look at as a potential killer until, that is, one of the people that they interviewed, who had been sort of in the social circle of the victim, who was in fact the ex-boyfriend of the victim, was asked the question, "How did you feel about her death?" And he responded, "I was sorry to see her dead." And that struck Wallace as odd and potentially revealing, since the killer would have seen the victim dead immediately after committing the act. Well, as it turned out, the ex-boyfriend had killed her. After an investigation that took a full year, Wallace and his team compiled enough circumstantial evidence to convict the ex-boyfriend, who Wallace calls Scott. His "I was sorry to see her dead" statement wasn't enough to prove his guilt on its own, of course, but it had pointed Wallace in what turned out to be the right direction. Wallace says, quote, "Scott's case taught me the value of paying close attention to every word a suspect might offer. We all choose the words we use. Sometimes we choose as a matter of habit. Sometimes we choose words that reflect, either consciously or subconsciously, the truth about how we feel or the truth about what really happened. I've learned to hang on every word." So you can infer certain facts from what someone says, even if they don't intend to reveal that information. If you know what to look for, how someone says something can be just as revealing as what they say. I'm curious to see how Wallace will distort this concept to make it look like the New Testament is a credible historical source, as that has been his method for the previous chapters. Well, Wallace gives an example of how forensic statement analysis, or FSA, works. Let's say the husband of a murdered woman is asked to write up a statement describing what he did last night. And he writes, "I took Amy, my beautiful wife of 31 years, out to dinner and a movie." Well, that suggests that he loved his wife and that he was proud of their marriage. He used her name. He said she was his beautiful wife. He mentioned how long they had been married. And you can contrast that to a similar statement like, "I took the wife out to dinner," which conveys the same information, but in a much different way. Or, more different still, "I took the old lady out to dinner." You can infer certain things from the person's choice of vocabulary and how he chooses to express what is basically the same thought. In giving one of the latter statements, is the husband attempting to distance himself from his wife? Does his choice of words indicate that he and his wife weren't close, or that his feelings about her were something other than loving? These are all questions that investigators employing FSA would ask and explore after reading such a statement. And Wallace is obviously giving us a very simple example here for demonstration purposes, but the problem here, I think, is obvious, and I suspect will only become more apparent once we transition from investigating crimes to investigating the Gospels. How can we be sure that the husband who wrote the first statement, the one about his beautiful wife of 31 years, Amy, wasn't intentionally being effusive about her to distance himself from the crime? Just because he describes her as beautiful and gives the impression of an adoring husband doesn't mean he didn't kill her. Suppose he did, and he's just trying to throw investigators off his trail. Or suppose the killing was a crime of passion or an accident. Even if their marriage wasn't a happy one in the end, the husband could still be overcome with regret and belated tender feelings towards his wife. And of course, Wallace knows all this. Wallace is well aware that the FSA technique can't give you substantive evidence on its own. It can just sort of give you suggestions, point you in the right direction. It then has to be backed up by substantiating evidence. And the problem, as we have run into again and again in this book to this point, with doing this with the Bible, is that there is no substantiating evidence. There's no evidence outside of the text itself to confirm, to validate what you might infer from doing an FSA style analysis on the biblical text. As I said, to his credit, Wallace does acknowledge these limitations of FSA. He says, quote, "Clearly, this sort of word examination is more an interpretive art than a hard science. But the more we understand the importance of words, the better we become at discerning their meanings. Remember, all of us choose the words we use, and we've got lots of words to choose from. Our words eventually give us away." So on that note, let's see how Wallace applies his FSA technique to the Gospels. He gets down to business in this chapter. He begins by sharing that when he first began studying the Gospels, he was fascinated by every single word. One thing he noticed was how in the Gospel of John, Mary, the mother of Jesus, was never referred to as Mary. John never refers to her by name. He only refers to her as Jesus' mother or the mother of Jesus. Whereas in the other three Gospels, she is named and referred to as Mary. Well, why might this be? FSA gave Wallace a possible explanation. Quote, "The answer might be found in the 19th chapter of John's Gospel, when Jesus entrusted Mary to John at the crucifixion. Jesus told John that Mary was now his mother, and he told Mary that John was now her son. John took Mary and cared for her as he would his own mother from this point on. Writing the Gospel of John many years later, it just may be that John was uncomfortable calling his own mother by her formal name. I'm sure by this time in his life, John was referring to Mary as, quote, my mother, unquote. It doesn't surprise me then that John would hesitate to call his adopted mother by her proper name in the Gospel." Well, right away, I see a big problem with what Wallace is doing here. He's treating the Gospel of John as though John the Apostle just sat down and wrote it. And that is the traditional view of the Gospel that is typically taken by Christian churches, but that is probably not how the Gospel actually came about. What we now know as the Gospel of John, like the other Gospels and like most other books that make up the Old and New Testament of the Bible, the Gospel of John was written and edited and rewritten by multiple anonymous authors. It's a waste of time to try and infer anything about the character of John as though he were an actual person from the text, because John didn't write it by himself, and in fact he may not have written any of it. Well, Wallace moves from examining the Gospel of John to examining the Gospel of Mark, again using this FSA technique. Using FSA, he presents several arguments that Mark was based on the eyewitness account of the Apostle Peter. For instance, Mark mentions Peter prominently throughout the text. Peter is both the first and last disciple of Jesus referred to. Peter was depicted more sympathetically than he was in the other Gospels. There are numerous minor details in Mark's text attributed to Peter or which point to Peter having a role in shaping the narrative, and Mark's approach to telling the story of Jesus roughly matches the approach taken by Peter when Peter is depicted preaching later on in the book of Acts, focusing on the public life of Jesus, omitting the birth narrative and other private details that are noted in the other Gospels. Quote, "By hanging on every word, we were able to construct a reasonable circumstantial case for the Gospel of Mark as an eyewitness account. When combined with the testimony of the early church, this evidence becomes even more powerful." Does it, though? As with his treatment of the book of John, Wallace's analysis of Mark assumes the book was actually written by Mark, as church tradition states. But, like John, the modern consensus among scholars is that Mark was written and edited by multiple authors who were working from earlier sources, not writing down their own experiences or recording the testimony of one particular eyewitness. And the irony is much of the evidence that convinced modern scholars to no longer accept the traditionally attributed authorships of the Gospels was found through textual analysis. which is very similar to what Wallace is attempting to do in this chapter. By analyzing the vocabulary, the writing style, the way the story is told compared to other versions of that story, the commonalities that can be identified between the gospel in question and other surviving literary works that would have been known in the time and place when the gospel was being written, most modern scholars have come to the conclusion that the gospels were not written by single authors and were not written all at once, but are the products of editing, redacting, and the insertion of interpolations. If you analyze the texts of the Gospels, consider their probable historical and literary contexts, and don't presume that they are what the Church traditionally says they are. Wallace has repeatedly cautioned us to leave our preconceptions behind when we begin investigations. It seems to me that it's very difficult to arrive at the conclusion that the Gospels were written solely by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and based on their personal experiences or those of credible witnesses that were personally known to them. And if you don't first reach that conclusion, the FSA employed by Wallace is meaningless, unless you're studying the Gospels in the same way a literature class would study a novel, and trying to identify and deconstruct characters, theme, etc. And by the way, studying the Gospels in that way can be a fascinating and rewarding activity, but it can't tell you anything about what actually happened in history. It can't do what Wallace is telling us it can do. Now, the tool from this chapter to add to our detective kit is to pay attention to the words witnesses use. Quote, "It's been fashionable recently to question the authenticity of the Gospels and the claims of the early church fathers related to their authorship. Were the Gospels intentionally misattributed to the apostles or their associates? Was there a conspiracy of some sort to make the Gospels seem authoritative? The forensic internal evidence of language can help us verify the claims of the early church related to those texts. The specific words used by the authors can teach us more than you might previously have thought possible." Well, a few points. It isn't necessary for the Gospels to have been intentionally misattributed, or for there to have been a conspiracy to give the impression the Gospels were more authoritative than they actually are. As texts are passed down from generation to generation, copied, shared, recopied, altered, expanded, edited, interpreted, and reinterpreted, etc., these things can happen naturally without any malicious intent or any will on the part of anybody. Remember, the Gospels themselves didn't take the form we now know until around the middle of the 2nd century, according to most estimates that I've read, and the New Testament canon wasn't formalized until centuries after that. Also, when Wallace says it's been fashionable recently to question the authenticity and authorship of the Gospels, what he means is over the last 200 years. He may not intend to mean that, but that is what he's referring to. The questioning of the traditional authorship of the Gospels and of the Bible in general goes back quite a long ways from where we stand today. Scholars questioning the traditional authorship of the Gospels and finding evidence that causes them to doubt that traditional authorship is not a recent trend. For instance, the two-source hypothesis, which states that the books of Matthew and Luke were based on the book of Mark and a second source called Q, was first proposed in 1838. Rejection of the traditional authorship of the Gospels is not some passing postmodern fad. It's the long-standing consensus position of the scholarly community. And, as I previously pointed out, that consensus was reached in part due to scholars doing exactly what Wallace urges us to do in that quote, using the internal evidence of the texts themselves to test the claims of the early church. Moving on to Chapter 6, which is titled Principle 6, Separate Artifacts from Evidence. The opening anecdote this time revolves around a trial resulting from one of Wallace's investigations, which was largely decided by what a jury made of a cigarette butt collected from the crime scene. DNA testing proved that the cigarette had not been smoked by the defendant in the case, a fact which the defense attorney used to suggest that someone else, the person who had smoked that cigarette, was the true killer, not the defendant. The defense's argument was not a good one, Wallace explains, because while that cigarette butt was collected from the area that police had roped off around the crime scene, it had been found about 50 feet from the point where the murder was actually committed, and police agreed that it was almost certainly not related to the crime at all. It just happened to be there at the crime scene, and it was collected and bagged as evidence just in case. The cigarette butt was an artifact from the crime scene. It was not actually evidence related to the crime. The case against the defendant was a substantial one. The cigarette butt didn't really do much to throw reasonable doubt into that case, and the jury ultimately voted to convict that defendant. Well, no messing about in this chapter as Wallace transitions directly from his opening anecdote to the Jesus stuff. It's vital to distinguish between evidence and artifacts when studying the Bible, you see. Wallace says, quote, "The Gospels claim to be eyewitness accounts, but you may be surprised to find that there are a few added textual artifacts nestled in with the evidential statements. It appears that scribes, in copying the texts over the years, added lines to the narrative that were not there at the time of the original writing." What? Well, color me disillusioned deep purple. I just cannot believe. Anyway, as an example of a probable artifact, Wallace offers the famous story of Jesus and the woman taken in adultery, the one where Jesus says, "He that is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone at her." Wallace notes that this story doesn't appear in the earliest surviving copies of the Gospel of John, and that still other copies of that Gospel place it in a different position in the text, while still other ancient New Testaments place that story in the Gospel of Luke, and it's not found in the Gospel of John at all. Well, Wallace lists 4 additional artifacts from the Gospels, including my personal favorite, the agony at Gethsemane from Luke 22, verses 43 through 44. I call this my favorite because I cited it in my first An Atheist Reads series to argue that despite claims to the contrary by the author and his cited expert, there were disputed passages of the New Testament that affected important doctrines of Christianity. Some scholars believe that the agony at Gethsemane was inserted into the text during the time when the early church leaders were debating the nature of Christ. And this passage was inserted into the story to bolster the argument that Christ had a dual nature and that he was fully God and fully human. And the notion was that, well, in Gethsemane, he was truly in agony. He felt real pain and real stress. He was fully human in that moment. And that argument was eventually accepted, and that is now the dominant view of the nature of Christ in most of Christianity, that he has a dual nature, fully man and fully human. Well, anyway, quote, "Skeptics have pointed to passages like these in an effort to demonstrate the unreliability of the biblical text as an eyewitness account. If these lines are fiction, how many more verses are also false? When I was an atheist, that was one of my prime complaints about the Bible, and I discovered that very few Christians were aware of the fact that these additions exist. I shook the faith of many of my Christian friends by simply demonstrating that these passages were not in the original biblical text." First and foremost, I want to give Wallace some credit here for even bringing this up. It suggests that his perception of the New Testament is not quite as simplistic as I thought it was after reading the previous chapters of this book. To acknowledge the existence and the number of probable interpolations in the text of the New Testament and to point them out to his audience of Christian readers is commendable, as is admitting that these interpolations include some of the most famous passages from these books. This is also a relatively rare example of a Christian apologist actually referring to a legitimate criticism of the Bible made by non-believers. Most atheists I know, particularly those who formerly identified as Christians, cite the historical unreliability of the Bible as having contributed to their non-belief. And one reason the Bible is considered to be unreliable as a source of history is the evidence that the text has been edited, redacted, rearranged, augmented, and otherwise altered from whatever its original version was. But that brings me to my second point. While I appreciate Wallace bringing up this topic at all, it's important to note that there really is no such thing as the original biblical text, not as far as we're concerned anyway. We can say with some confidence that certain passages were added to the text much later than others, but that doesn't mean the passages that aren't obvious interpolations make up some sort of pristine document. Wallace's view of the Gospels seems to be that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote down their accounts from start to finish, and then a few lines here and there were added by others through the years as the books were being copied and passed around. And while that is closer to the truth than insisting that the Gospels which we have today are word for word the divinely inspired work of the traditional authors, it still sounds less like the view of someone genuinely, fearlessly seeking the truth, and more like the view of an apologist, which it is. Wallace offers us a few tips for identifying artifacts. Look for items that were found much later than the rest of the evidence, items that weren't documented during the original search of the crime scene. Recognize items that are clearly not related to the crime, such as paraphernalia left behind by paramedics at the crime scene. Hypothesize how the item in question would affect the case if included in evidence to determine what, if any, impact it would have. Consider items in the larger context of the case, and don't worry about excluding something from evidence if you have numerous pieces of good evidence all pointing in another direction. Quote, "We can apply these principles as we examine the New Testament and evaluate questionable passages to determine if they are evidence or artifacts. Luckily, we have photographs of the early crime scene to help us. We have hundreds of early ancient manuscripts that can give us a snapshot of what the text looked like before anyone added anything to the narrative. Once these late additions have been exposed in this way, we can simply choose to ignore the passages as artifacts and focus on the remainder as evidence." First, most importantly, and for what feels like the 10th time, even though we're only a third of the way through this series, the Gospels are not photographs of a crime scene. The Gospels are not analogous to photos of a crime scene. The earliest surviving copies of the Gospels don't give us a snapshot of what the text looked like before anyone added anything to the narrative, just what the text might have looked like before the passages identified as interpolations were added. What Wallace doesn't mention is that the oldest ancient manuscripts of the New Testament that survive are not the original documents or even first-generation copies of the original documents. And even if they were, the stories they contain existed as oral traditions before they were written down. There are simply too many opportunities for the narrative to have been changed along the way for us to treat those early manuscripts as authoritative originals. Wallace offers three possible explanations for why scribes copying the New Testament documents might have intentionally added to the text. They were trying to harmonize one passage with another. They were adding a relevant detail that was known to them but unknown to the author. Or they were clarifying the meaning of a passage based on what they thought it meant. And that's it. Those are the only possible explanations that Wallace proposes. Nothing about political motivations or scribes more sympathetic to a particular camp of early Christianity opportunistically changing the text to bring it a bit more in line with their preferred interpretation. The only explanations Wallace proposes for scribes adding to the text are ones that preserve the innocence and best intentions of the scribes, and in most cases preserve the truth, the validity, the reliability of the added passages. He's saying just because these are interpolations added much later doesn't mean they're not true. This strikes me as simplistic and naive, to say the least. Quote, "The mere presence of the artifacts is not an insurmountable obstacle for us. There are passages in the text that are evidence for the life of Jesus, and there are extra textual artifacts that must be separated. When we successfully separate the textual artifacts from the biblical evidence, we can determine what happened over 2,000 years ago. The mere presence of textual artifacts is not an insurmountable obstacle for us." Just as the mere presence of the needless repetition of the exact same sentence at the beginning and end of that quote, or the absence of competent editing, was obviously not an insurmountable obstacle for this book's publication. I'm sorry, that's the snarky English major in me fighting his way to the surface. Anyway, what Wallace says here is not unreasonable, assuming we are supposed to treat the Bible like any other historical document. A few artifacts here and there shouldn't be enough on their own to discredit the entire thing. But despite the focus of much of Wallace's writing to this point, the claim being made is not merely that the New Testament is a mostly reliable historical document. The claim being made is that the New Testament is the Word of God. The Bible is said to be a book like no other. It contains the eternal truth of God Almighty. It is infallible, inerrant, without contradiction. How do you harmonize the belief that a book is the inspired Word of God with the fact that the same book is filled with interpolations and other evidence suggesting very strongly that it was not actually written by the people it claims it was written by? What was the point of God inspiring the original authors of the Bible to write down His inerrant truth only to allow later writers and editors to insert their own work for their own reasons? Was the omnipotent God of the universe powerless to stop the text of His perfect word from being altered in this way? Or were the scribes responsible for the later editions also inspired by God? And if that's the case, why would Wallace even bring it up in the first place? If the interpolations are just as true and inspired as the earlier text, what does it matter when they were added? The tool for our detective kit in this chapter is knowing how to pick out artifacts from evidence. For the Bible, the method used in doing that is textual criticism, and Wallace has this to say about that. Quote, "The art of textual criticism allows us to compare manuscripts to determine what belongs and what does not. The same process that revealed to me as a skeptic the passages that couldn't be trusted also revealed to me as a believer the passages that can be trusted. Textual criticism allows us to determine the nature of the original texts as we eliminate the textual artifacts. This should give us more confidence in what we have, not less." Did Wallace just unwittingly admit that his interpretation of the findings of textual criticism of the Bible is influenced by the fact that he is now a believer in Christianity? I know I'm a beginner at this forensic statement analysis stuff, but I find how he chose to phrase that somewhat revealing. The same process that showed the biblical text to be unreliable when he was a non-believer shows it to be reliable now that he is a believer. Wallace is correct about one thing. Textual criticism is a powerful tool that can be used to evaluate the texts of the Bible. And it does give us more confidence in what we have. And what it tells us is that we have a Bible that is flawed, filled with contradictions, bad history, and spurious claims, and that is most certainly not the result of divine inspiration, but the work of ordinary human beings. Well, that's it for Chapter 6. In the next video, I will return with looks at Chapter 7, Principle number 7, Resist Conspiracy Theories. Always good advice. And Chapter 8, Principle number 8, Respect the Chain of Custody. That's it for me this week. Thank you all for watching. Please comment on this video, be you atheist, Christian, whatever. Tell me what I got right. Tell me what I got wrong. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it. Subscribe to this channel if you're not subbed already. And also, please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. I'm still inching ever closer to my next Patreon milestone, which is a series of high-quality, brand-new audio-only podcasts based on the An Atheist Reads series. So check it out if that's something you're interested in. Please consider supporting this channel on Patreon. Thanks again, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you next time.